We uncovered the fact that China was working very closely with Russia, as well as Iran, to import both of these countries' oil. And then so we kind of took another step and layer below that and started looking at the different financial connections. And that's where we really uncovered the fact that what we think is happening is that there is an axis of evasion where China, Iran, Russia, as well as North Korea are all working together.
Hello and welcome to Season 3 of Public Key. I'm your returning host, Eitan Danon. Have you heard terms like Economic Statecraft, Jurisdictional Arbitrage, or Axis of Evasion and wondered what they meant or how they applied to cryptocurrency and sanctions? Well, in this episode, I speak with Kimberly Donovan, Director of the Economic Statecraft Initiative at the Atlantic Council, who demystifies these terms and their impact on the global economy. She examines the evolving landscape of blockchain, sanctions, and global finance, and explains her journey from the US federal government to becoming a leading voice in NatSec and digital currencies. Kim also underscores the importance of AML CFT to deter illicit actors from abusing the international financial system to ensure strong oversight. Before we jump into the episode, we at Chainalysis will be hosting our flagship event, Links, on April 1st and 2nd in the heart of New York City. Hear directly from some of the best speakers in the industry, including Caroline Hill of Circle, Lily Liu of Solana Foundation, Paolo Ardino, CEO of Tether, cybersecurity reporter and author Andy Greenberg, and former IRS CI Special Agent Tigran Gambarian. Tickets sell out every year. Get yours now by heading down to the show notes. Now, on to our episode. I'm here with my friend Kim Donovan, Director of the Atlantic Council's Economic Statecraft Initiative. Welcome to the pod, Kim.
Hi, Eitan. Thanks for having me.
Absolutely. Before we jump in, can you tell our listeners, how did you get your start in crypto? What kind of brought you to the wild world of digital assets?
Sure. So even if I could take a step back behind that and talk a little bit about the work that we do at the Atlantic Council, just to provide some context. As you mentioned, I lead our Economic Statecraft Initiative. And so my team, we look at all the sources of economic power that governments use to advance national security objectives. We measure their effectiveness. And then we also look at the kind of underpinnings of what creates sanctions evasion and money laundering, things like that. And our team is part of a broader center called the Geoeconomic Center, which looks at the nexus of finance, economics, and foreign policy. So that's where we also have teams that look at future capitalism and what direction Bretton Woods institutions are going in, as well as future of payments, such as blockchain technology and just kind of this innovation can move forward in the future. So for me, where I got started in crypto, before I joined the Atlantic Council, I worked in the federal government for 15 years in the intel community, as well as National Security Council, Treasury, and my last role was head of intelligence at FinCEN. And the entirety of my career, I've really been following the money of illicit actors and trying to better understand where we can impact them to disrupt their activities and just kind of protect American population from harm. So when I was at FinCEN, I first was there as chief of staff from 2019 to 2020, and this was during Trump's first administration. And at that time, they really had a different perspective on crypto and really want to try to regulate this space pretty heavily. So as chief of staff, I worked very closely across FinCEN as well as the regulatory community and with the Treasury Department to identify current intelligence requirements that we needed in this space, as well as kind of policy directions, enforcement actions, and the regulatory environment. And then when I moved over to the intelligence division, where I was first the deputy associate director and eventually acting associate director, I really felt that there was a need to better understand this space. So within the authorities that I had, I worked with my team to develop an entire office of cyber and technology innovation. And the whole purpose of this office was to kind of train up and recruit different people that understood how the blockchain worked, how crypto worked in general, so that we could inform law enforcement investigations or OFAC actions and just kind of better understand this space, and also to inform in the policy and regulatory side of the house so that they could make better regulations as it relates to this space.
Excellent. So that's kind of how, throughout the long journey of stuff that you've done in service of the U.S. government and of national security, you kind of made your way to technology and the cyber realm. You mentioned sanctions evasion, and that's a topic that I think is near and dear to both of our hearts. You have done a lot of research and work lately on something that you call the Axis of Evasion. Here at Chainalysis, we're seeing more countries use crypto and come up with clever ways to evade international sanctions. We see that quite a bit from the parts of Russia and North Korea and others. It would be great for our listeners to get a little bit of color from you on your research and what you think is happening and how you think the international community should respond to this trend.
That's a great question. Yeah, so the Axis of Evasion is something that my colleague Maya Nicolazze and I developed actually around a year ago. We were doing a lot of research trying to better understand the effectiveness of the sanctions targeting Russia and how Russia was trying to evade them. And that's where we uncovered the fact that China was working very closely with with Russia as well as Iran to import both of these countries' oil. And then so we kind of took another step and layer below that and started looking at the different financial connections. And that's where we really uncovered the fact that what we think is happening is that there is an axis of evasion where China, Iran, Russia, as well as North Korea are all working together, whether to prop up their own economies. So they're, through trade, through financial connectivity, even like a barter system at play in all of this. And it's a pretty sophisticated money laundering scheme going on. So within this axis of evasion, one of our kind of main points is that whether it's traditional finance or on the blockchain with crypto, we need to start looking at these problems as a network, right? So I think historically from a especially U.S. government perspective, whether on the policy side or enforcement side, we've been looking at these issues in silos. We have one policy towards China, we have one towards Russia, one for Iran, one for North Korea. And we've been advocating for it's time to start looking at this as a network of actors so we can better unpack and understand how they're working together, what those financial connections are, and then be able to identify different nodes and vulnerabilities to either counter or address or just kind of mitigate some of this connection that is helping them evade the U.S. as well as broader Western sanctions. Unfortunately, in order to do that, we really do need to be working with our foreign partners. And again, on the traditional finance side as well as in the crypto space, because we're stronger together, as some folks like to say. But I think a great example of this was the recent Treasury designation that I think came out last week. Things kind of blend together right now on the Z servers designation. So
right.
is that
you put a blog out on that?
Yeah, that was great. By the way, so it was the Russia-based bulletproof hosting service provider, and so I thought that was a fantastic example of where this multilateral action could really come into play to have an effect. So this is where the US, UK, as well as Australia designated this activity. And then what we saw was that within days after that sanctions announcement, the Dutch police just took off 127 servers offline that were associated to this.
Not to be outdone.
Right, exactly.
Right.
So for me, the big points here that we need to start looking at this activity as a network, but then also we need to be working with our foreign partners to counter this activity, because this is cross-border activity, and if the U.S. kind of goes it alone, we might be missing the ball on a few things. And that kind of leads me to my third point on jurisdictional arbitrage. It's always a talking point everywhere, especially when you get into the crypto space. But I think right now, jurisdictional arbitrage is a pretty big deal, in that we need to be, again, working with our partners, but developing consistent regulations. Because as soon as you get into that arbitrage space where the U.S. has a different kind of regulatory environment and rules and laws governing this space versus our foreign partners, that's where the bad guys can take advantage of it. And so it's, I think we need to continue to work with our foreign partners, whether it's through FATF or other kind of multilateral standard setting bodies, to make sure that we're all on the same page when it comes to AML CFT in this space, but then also just making sure that our regulations are consistent so that, again, these illicit actors and bad guys just can't take advantage of this system.
Definitely. I think rules and laws and norms matter greatly, and it might not be the sexiest talking point, but I think we ignore it at our own peril. A lot of attention is paid to how crypto can undermine the effectiveness of sanctions. It would be great to get your take on how you see crypto strengthening. You've had various enforcement and investigations and intel-centric roles kind of pay a lot of attention to the fact that the blockchain is unclassified. It can facilitate international collaboration. Specifically, one concrete example to throw out, I'd love your take, is Russia's recent about face and the fall on crypto. So for a while they were, you could call it ambivalent at best. They've kind of done something of an about face. We put a blog out about it too that I'd encourage our listeners to go read, legalizing crypto for mining and cross-border payments. So how do you see kind of these pieces coming together vis-a-vis effectiveness of Western sanctions in particular?
Yeah, I think there are so many features of the blockchain that are actually very helpful for investigations. I mean, it's one of the few kind of technologies out there where you can see it go step to step. But in order for that to really happen, I think that's where the crypto industry needs to continue to work with governments to ensure that AML CFT there's compliance there and that it is kind of a real focus and priority. But that's also where, I think there's probably maybe greater engagement between the traditional financial system and crypto and government, right? Like all kind of three pillars that need to come together on these issues, because sometimes it's very difficult to figure out who owns a wallet. And some of the technology within the crypto space, like mixers or anonymous tokens, that becomes a really big problem for enforcement and investigations. So the more collaboration that there can be between like the banks that are on-ramping and off-ramping, as well as kind of this crypto space, and I think you can better kind of track what's going on and then weed out the bad activity and separate it from regular people doing, their thing on the chain. So I'm glad that you brought up the Russia about phase, because I think that's been a really interesting dynamic to this situation. Because as you mentioned, I mean, Russia was historically like very anti-crypto. They didn't want anything to do with this. But what we've been seeing is that with the onset of sanctions and how heavily, especially Russia, has been cut out from the international financial system, they're seeking alternatives, right? So they're looking at everything. They've been using national currencies, right? They're trading in rupees and yuan and kind of anything that they can do. So they're also looking at crypto. So I think that this change in their policy is a direct result of like desperation and needing to figure out how else can they transact in a cross-border way. But that said, it's going to be interesting because even though like if Russia's like fully embraced Bitcoin or whichever coin they're using, it doesn't necessarily mean that their trading partners are keen to use that for trade. So it's an interesting development and step forward. I think it is a direct result of the sanctions that have been placed on them and how they've been kind of cut out from traditional finance. But there's also some dependencies here because whoever they're trading with, they may not want to trade in Bitcoin. And this is kind of a case in point like with China. There's a lot to unpack with China, but right. But historically been very anti-crypto and in preference of using their own CBDC, right? ECNY. Kind of there are other payment systems that they developed within China. So I don't really see a situation where China is going to be like trading with Russia using Bitcoin, but we are seeing where there is a lot of trade between China and Russia in national currencies.
Absolutely. This past year in our Geography of Cryptocurrency report, on the one hand, you have the Chinese authorities saying no to permissionless crypto. And yet, from an adoption perspective, lots of different use cases that are licit, illicit, and kind of in between. So we frequently say that the fastest way to increase adoption is to ban something, certainly in advanced and tech literate societies. I want to pick apart a thread that you just mentioned, the relationship of crypto to global trade. So our annual crypto crime report, which came out recently, the Sanctions section, had a huge geopolitical nexus. What our geniuses found was that at flashpoints and kind of key inflection points in the past year of the Iran-Israel shadow war and kind of tensions in the Middle East, we saw a spike on chain of activity and lots of interesting patterns. Definitely download the section and read it if you have not already, or the report in its entirety. So beyond Iran, even we've seen Venezuela use crypto to conduct trade outside of the SWIFT architecture. So I guess my question for you, I know crypto is not everything you do. I know it fits into the ESI and to the Geoeconomic Center, but how does this shift challenge the international trade system as we know it? And do you see it, we have one example that's specific to Iran, but do you see it kind of destabilizing international trade itself or the way we conceptualize economic blocks in the world?
That's a really good question. The United States derives a lot of its economic power from the strength of the U.S. dollar. That's why sanctions and other economic tools are so impactful. But that's also why I think you've seen this interest in moving towards alternative currencies, and I would include crypto as one of those alternative currencies. So from a trading standpoint, I think that there's a few things in the mix here, right? I know we just previously mentioned Russia, but I neglected to note too that I thought it was really interesting that the EU, as part of their latest Russia sanctions package, they went after Garantex. So even though, again, there's this huge push to try to use crypto for cross-border payments with Russia, well, if the EU as well as the U.S. continue their enforcement and sanctions of different exchanges, that's going to limit Russia's ability to do what it wants. So there's that kind of component of it, of where sanctions can also impact this global trade and cross-border payment system in the crypto space. I am really interested in looking at kind of where China is moving in this space. Because again, we're really focused on this axis of evasion. So where China is making big moves, where then it could potentially maybe enable these other sanctioned regimes like Iran and Russia and North Korea, if they gain access to these systems, help them evade sanctions. But that's where China, with their CBDC, the ECNY, as well as these different projects like mBridge that they work on with the UAE. I think Saudi Arabia is now a part of mBridge, as well as Hong Kong and Thailand. The whole purpose of that is to figure out how do we do cross-border payments using CBDCs. And you
Right.
don't necessarily need to use ECNY. You can use the digital dirham. You can use whatever your kind of central bank digital currency is. But the fact that there's a platform out there to encourage and enable trade using a central bank digital currency that is outside the U.S. dollar system, so outside U.S. jurisdiction, I think in the long run, that's going to be a very interesting thing for us to keep our eye on.
I think a lot of people are like, Enbridge, I'm familiar with that, but it doesn't necessarily set in, what the implications are, or maybe the second or third order effects of normalizing that activity. Certainly, not to get sucked into a political vortex in the U.S., the idea of a CBDC in the U.S. has been hotly debated for a long time, but I think putting that aside, if we can, the example of Enbridge and kind of other things that are happening in and around the BIS ecosystem, central bank to central bank, beg certainly additional attention and analysis. So I'm glad someone's doing it.
Yeah, no, I mean, absolutely, right? Because it's, we do a lot of research on the dominance of the U.S. dollar, especially in international trade. And for right now, dollar's still very strong. It's 88% of world reserve currency. But if these different developments continue to move forward and the U.S. is not part of the conversation, how strong will the dollar be going forward?
I want to switch gears just for a second. So you're an expert. You worked at FinCEN. You worked on the NSC. You're now in the think tank space. At Chainalysis, and blockchain analytics in particular, we see ourselves as playing a critical role in shedding light on very opaque and sometimes inaccessible problems. If something is a denied area, there's no embassy, there's no presence, there's no way for a government or private sector partner to get information, we can shed light. As someone who has worn many different hats, private adjacent, but in between public and private, how effective do you think the current data toolkit is? And Kim in 2025 talking to Kim in 2019, what would you say, hang tight, something really cool is on its way to you, or you should focus on this because the industry is not paying any attention to it and there are solutions that need to be developed? Where do you see the need?
Yeah, if I had any advice for, myself 5-10 years ago,
you'd be like, watch out, there's something called the coronavirus that's headed your way. Everyone's going to laugh at you, but you won't leave your house for 2 years.
Buy as many masks as you possibly can.
Right.
And toilet paper.
Right.
No, I think I would have really paid more attention to the crypto space, honestly. I mean, I think even though I got involved in 2019, I became more entrenched in it. There was so much going on at that point. I should have started paying attention years before and learning how to use, the on-chain tracking and tracing systems like Chain Reactor. No, I think that it's interesting because what I've seen is a huge proliferation of commercial data over the past several years. So whether it's blockchain kind of tracing technology and platforms, risk intelligence platforms that can just compile different sanctions data, it's all out there. And I see that as a pretty clear sign that it's needed, it's filling a gap, right? The governments continue to emphasize and increase the use of sanctions and export controls and every other kind of economic tool that we have available. And we're relying on the commercial and private sector to be the tip of the spear for in compliance and really enforcing these different sanction measures. But they may not have all the information that they need to do that well. And so that's where I think, all this commercial data and these different tool sets have come online and been incredibly helpful. But it's also, I get a little concerned, honestly, because, you have to pay for these services.
Right.
And there's, maybe some smaller companies that have major compliance requirements, but they just don't have the ability to buy the different toolkits that they need. So again, I think it's incredibly important that this space has kind of filled that gap for the government. But I think that the government could do more to offer different types of information to strongly encourage compliance of their actions going forward. But I don't really see that happening anytime soon.
I think a lot of integration of technology too. I mean, a lot of those decisions tend to be, historically have been above our pay grades, and it's, having both been on the inside in NatSec in the U.S., a lot of times it's more Dunder Mifflin than it is Jack Ryan, and so fighting a bureaucracy that can at times seem East German is also part of the battle. I want to go back to something you were discussing. So going back to the Axis of Evasion, could you unpack? We had Tom Keating on the show from RUSI, Matt Pines from Sentinel-1. This kind of recurring theme comes up of CRIN, right? China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. Cringe if you add global extremism. Do you certainly, whether it's a formal alliance or not, there is some kind of block. Do you see this as a group of equals? Do you see one or several more as a vassal state of China, as some have argued in the pages of Foreign Affairs? Do you see this as an in-between? Is it more of a you scratch my back, I'll scratch yours? I think the naysayers have pointed to history. The Safavids and the Romanovs were not friends, and Persia as a civilization, Russia, China, these are not natural allies. So how do you see the power dynamic internal to the axis that you describe? And perhaps what are the points of leverage or ways that policymakers and folks in industry can kind of protect their assets? And you could define assets however you like.
I see this as a marriage of convenience, or one of the few things that all of these countries have in common is that they're heavily sanctioned. So we've kind of used, maybe inadvertently, but we've kind of pushed all these countries to kind of figure out how can they continue to do business, get the money that they need, transact, get the technology that they need. And then so they're looking inward and looking at each other. And where there may be opportunity, I think really depends on our understanding of how these actors are working together. Some people use like axis of autocracies, axis of oppressors.
Right, axis of upheaval.
There's like axis of anything. What I like about our axis of evasion is that the axis that we're talking about is actually the financial connectivity. So it just so happens that China and Russia and Iran and North Korea, they're all working together out of necessity. But as a result of that, they are sharing, techniques, tactics, procedures. But the really critical thing here is that they're connecting their financial system. And that is all happening outside of U.S. jurisdiction, U.S. monitoring authority. Like, we have no visibility into a lot of this. And so at a certain point, it can weaken the strength of our sanctions and other economic tools if we can't see what's going on. That's where, I think the best thing that we can do as a government is to, again, start looking at these actors as a network and not kind of considering different policy approaches within silos. Again, as we consider lifting sanctions on different regimes while placing heavier sanctions on others, we need to be looking at this holistically, because if we lift sanctions on one, we enable them all.
Sustained pressure is the order du jour then.
Yeah, that would be my recommendation.
Right.
But I think that's where it's also for like the private sector, where they need to also be thinking and considering is looking at all of these states as a network, so that they can then also mitigate their own risk of who are they doing business with, just so that they don't end up in a heap of trouble down the line.
Do you, they're all facing U.S. and international sanctions, perhaps the Chinese a bit less. However, if with the threat of a crisis in the Taiwan Strait looming, is that something that you see intensifying if the foreign policy tool, of choice remains economic sanctions, at least in the U.S.? And do you see that cooperation intensifying?
I think it's kind of to be seen what direction things go. I think at least we've seen of late, which we're all still trying to figure out the direction that we're going from a foreign policy perspective, but it seems like President Trump is more keen to use tariffs over sanctions, so that's something that we're at least on the lookout for. Our team, within the last couple of years, did do some research and analysis to look at what would it actually cost the global economy if we did sanction China in a Taiwan crisis, and similar to what we did with Russia. And we found that
like an economic war game.
Yes, basically, yeah.
Right.
But I thought it was interesting because when we ran the numbers just on what sanctioning, I think it was 4 of China's largest banks, we would be putting $3 trillion of the global economy at risk immediately. So, there's some things, it's not to say it's impossible. We just have to kind of mitigate a few different...
Think critically, right.
Think critically, think comprehensively, so that we don't inadvertently hurt ourselves with our own actions. But no, I think that we just need to be looking at these issues comprehensively and as a network.
Excellent. Well, I want to, if I can, switch gears a little bit. We've been doing a lot of Axis of Upheaval, Russia, China. I want to talk about terrorism. You have long experience in the counterterrorism space. You know a thing or two. It takes one to know one, so sorry for outing you there. How concerned should governments be, in your mind, about terrorist organizations using crypto? Put out a bunch of blogs and content, there was a lot of hysteria, there was misinformation, a lot of incorrect analysis in the past year of not only Hamas, Hezbollah, Islamist and Iran-affiliated groups, how they engage with technology writ large and use the blockchain in particular. It'd be great to get your take on that. And then beyond kind of Islamist terrorism, how do you look at something like neo-Nazis and the alt-right? In our crypto crime report this year, we put a section out on extremism and so it's a diverse playing field, and there's no shortage of actors who are using all manner of coins and tokens and ways of transferring value. So how do you kind of see the landscape, especially in places where there might be limited oversight or just some of the challenges enforcement-wise that you've seen in your public sector career?
Sure. So I think it's a Bruce Lee quote, water, it'll find a way. So bad guys, whether they're terrorists, drug dealers, illicit actors, are going to find a way to move money.
Right.
And so crypto is one option. I think, we continue to see in the traditional financial space where we're talking trillions of dollars of illicit financial activity a year. I think, NASDAQ has a report I like to quote often because it has a big number, but they did research in 2023 indicating that there was over $3 trillion of illicit finance went through the traditional financial system in that year. Yeah, it's a lot of money. Right? And then within that report, too, I think there's over $450 billion of fraud that was lost. So this is a lot of money that is kind of also going through traditional financial system. So while terrorists or other illicit actors do use crypto because it is another mechanism to move and transfer funds or assets, still continue to launder money through traditional finance, and cash is still king, right? Cash is not traceable. So everybody wants cash. So I think it's just we need to continue to emphasize the importance of AML CFT and making sure that whether it is in the crypto space or the banks or exchanges, that those standards of AML CFT and the compliance is happening. And then when it's not, let's use our enforcement tools to try to enforce this different sanctions or other types of compliance measures, so that it also can send a clear message that this activity is not going to be tolerated. But then also maybe there's some lessons learned of what happened and what went wrong in one situation where an enforcement case was pushed forward, so that others can kind of learn from that and try to shore up their own compliance. But I think on the government side, crypto it's new, it's innovation. I don't see this going away anytime soon. I think it's something that we're embracing, and it can be the future of how kind of payment systems work, or at least as another means of how it works. But if that's the case, then we also need to be resourcing the government to be able to do this type of analysis and investigations. The team that I helped form at FinCEN, I think, I'm biased, but they are the best in the business, but they're really small. They're super small, right? So we need more crypto analysts and investigators across law enforcement, across all of the regulatory agencies, not only to kind of investigate when bad activity is happening, but better understand how these systems work so that we can inform when law enforcement investigations should kick in versus how do we improve regulation to make sure that this space is, appropriately regulated and not kind of cut off at the knees. And sorry, my last point on this too, and I know I mentioned it before, but I always am concerned about jurisdictional arbitrage. If the U.S. goes in one direction and our partners go in their own directions, which especially right now, when you look at the regulatory environment when it comes to the crypto space, at least from my perspective, it appears that a lot of it is domestically focused. But crypto is inherently cross-border.
Right. The blockchain is international and 24/7. Right.
So, if you have all of these different domestic regulatory regulations, that creates a really complicated environment from a enforcement and compliance standpoint, but also an amazing environment for illicit actors to take advantage of where there is jurisdictional arbitrage and make the system work for them.
Excellent. Well, that's kind of something of a bridge to my next and perhaps my final question for you is around tying this all together. I mean, the Economic Statecraft Initiative. A lot of statecraft focuses on do not, we will sanction you, we will levy tariffs against you, kind of threat-based and negative actions. Can you talk us through a little bit some carrots instead of sticks? I mean, a lot of our research, if you read the GEO's report, you will learn a lot beyond China and Russia and the rest. You will learn a lot about adoption in those countries and in emerging markets too, in Latin America and sub-Saharan Africa, where there is incredible adoption and growth of technology writ large, of mobile payments, and specifically of cryptocurrency. Focus on remittances and cross-border payments and all kinds of clever financing schemes, and not schemes, but financial empowerment stories stories. So how do you, perhaps for us to end on a happy note, or an optimistic one, how do you see cryptocurrency as a tool, to help? And I'm sure that ties in a little bit because a lot of the great power competition unfolds in these other parts of the world. So how do you see crypto kind of helping some of these emerging markets transform their economies and resist perhaps some of the jurisdictional arbitrage that you've discussed on this pod?
I love ending on a positive note. So,
question for the Oxford Union, maybe.
No, I'm glad you raised this because one of the things I didn't get into, but another area that my team really focuses on is what we call positive economic statecraft. So it's the carrots, right? You can't just have a stick. You got to have some carrots. And so we consider that to be the affirmative actions, the inducement, developments, investments that we can kind of work with other countries on. And, it's a bit of soft power. So I think that there's a lot of room in the crypto space for this. As you've described, there's a ton of opportunity for financial inclusion, and especially in these communities where they have not had much access to the traditional financial system, or they can't get into it. So I think that there is a lot to be said of how crypto can inform this space. And, not to keep harping on it, but I just think that that's where the U.S. could really come in. And I get from a soft power standpoint of when we are not somewhere, China or other adversaries are. So whatever we can do now to encourage kind of adoption of kind of U.S. kind of based platforms, coins, chains, I think that would be in our best interest.
Like a USD pegged stablecoin, something
there
like
you
that.
go.
Would be an example.
Would be an example. Right, because then it's also it's something where the technology is hopefully built on kind of our standards of what we expect from this AML CFT kind of compliance versus China or maybe some of the other actors in this space. They may be less concerned. So I think that there's a way that we can encourage adoption of crypto to enable different third countries to kind of beef up their economies and strengthen their financial systems. But I would hope that it would be within kind of the guidelines of what at least the United States considers to be a sound and secure AML CFT compliance regime.
Time will tell, I guess, in the in the months and years ahead too, how not only what happens on the U.S. front, but the international reverberations. Thank you very much for the conversation. You are very cool. The Economic Statecraft Initiative is very cool. For folks who want to get in touch with you, how do you recommend they do that?
Check out our website, atlanticcouncil.org, and look for the Economic Statecraft Initiative.
Excellent. Thanks so much, and I'll see you soon, Kim.
Thanks, Eitan.
Kim really is deep into economic statecraft, the axis of evasion, and global challenges relating to crypto and sanctions evasion. Kim highlighted concerns around jurisdictions like Iran. On March 4th, OFAC designated Iran-based Behruz Parsarad the administrator of Nemesis Darknet Marketplace, including 44 Bitcoin addresses and 5 Monero addresses, due to his role in facilitating the sale of fentanyl and other drugs around the world, including to the US. Check out our blog, in which we analyze the on-chain activity of this network and Nemesis's role in facilitating cybercrime, as well as the on-chain connections of Nemesis and Parsarad to other players in the DNM ecosystem. Head down to the show notes and click on the link to see the full analysis.